The chain snapped before the excavator operator even had time to brace for it. A crack loud enough to send two men diving sideways off the equipment, the broken length of steel whipping across the clearing and burying itself in a stack of fresh-cut timber 6 feet away. The foreman didn't wait for anyone to ask if they were all right. He was already climbing down, already done. "That's it," he said, wiping mud off his hands like it might take the frustration with it. "We've pulled bigger things than this. This one isn't coming out." The stump sitting in the middle of the new road path was enormous. A white pine felled decades before anyone on that crew was born, its root crown buried deep into the hillside, roots running out in every direction like the thing had spent a century anchoring itself specifically against the day somebody would try this. 2 excavators, half a mile of chain between them, and an afternoon of failed attempts had left nothing to show for it but torn up ground and a busted hydraulic line. Eli Mercer, 78 years old, watched from the edge of the road without saying much of anything. When the engineer finally walked over to explain, apologetically, that they'd already calculated the force required and it simply wasn't enough, Eli asked him one question. "Where'd you find the first root?" The engineer pointed toward the torn earth around the stump. Eli shook his head. "That's not the root." A couple of the younger crew laughed, assuming the old man was making some kind of joke about a tree stump. He wasn't. He turned and walked toward the equipment shed at the edge of his property, a shed nobody on that crew had any reason to think held anything more useful than rusted farm junk, and pulled back a tarp that hadn't come off in years. His father's 1948 Caterpillar D8 sat underneath it, faded yellow, entirely mechanical, built before anyone thought a bulldozer needed a computer to know what it was doing. What Eli was about to pull out of that hillside wasn't just a stump the modern machines couldn't handle. It was something his own father had spent 40 years quietly protecting, for reasons Eli himself hadn't fully understood until that afternoon. As you watch, see if you can figure out what an old man knew about that ground before the contractors ever broke it, because the tree wasn't the thing they should have been afraid of moving. Eli had farmed and logged this 94 acres his entire life, the same ground his father Warren had worked before him and his grandfather before that. The county road widening project had been debated for the better part of 2 decades before finally getting funded, and when the survey crew first walked the property line, Eli hadn't argued about the road itself. He'd only asked, quietly, whether the route could shift 20 yards east. It couldn't. County right-of-way didn't bend for one old man's preference. Not without a reason he was prepared to explain, and Eli hadn't been prepared to explain the reason he had. He'd avoided that particular corner of the property for the better part of 30 years, not obviously, not in any way that would have drawn questions, just a habit of routing fence work and firewood cutting around it without ever quite admitting to himself why. He remembered the exact afternoon his father had first warned him off it, though he'd been young enough at the time that the memory had gone soft at the edges the way old memories do. He'd been maybe 12, out cutting brush along the hillside with Warren, and he'd raised his axe toward a low branch on the big pine without thinking twice about it. Not that one. Warren's voice had come out sharper than Eli was used to hearing from him, sharp enough that Eli lowered the axe immediately. "Never that one, you hear me? Not a branch. Not the trunk. Not even if she comes down in a storm on her own. You leave the roots be." "Why not, Daddy?" Warren had looked at the tree a long moment, the way a man looks at something he's decided not to fully explain. "Some things a family just protects," he'd finally said. "Don't need a reason beyond that. Someday, maybe, you'll understand it better than I'm explaining it now. Till then, just trust me on it." Eli had trusted him on it for the better part of 60 years, the instructions settling into the same category as a dozen other pieces of his father's advice he'd never fully questioned. Sentiment, he'd always assumed, some private grief or memory attached to a tree that had simply always been there. Warren Mercer had never explained the instruction fully, and Eli, being a practical man who'd inherited a practical operation, had mostly assumed it was sentiment, some memory attached to the tree that his father hadn't wanted disturbed. Now the county was about to disturb it whether Eli wanted them to or not, and some old, half-buried unease he'd been carrying for 3 decades had finally caught up with him. The shed hadn't been opened in 15 years, and the D8 underneath the tarp looked, at first glance, like exactly the museum piece the younger crew members assumed it was: faded yellow paint, rust along the tracks, a machine built the year Eli's father brought it home new off a rail car. Starting it wasn't as simple as turning a key. Eli worked through the ritual his father had taught him at 17, patient in a way modern machinery never asked anyone to be anymore. He checked the fuel first, wiped 60 years of dust from the sight glass with his thumb, and found himself, without quite meaning to, back in a different decade entirely. He'd been 17 the first time his father let him start it alone, standing exactly where Eli was standing now, hands shaking slightly the way a boy's hands shake when a father's watching him do something that matters. Don't rush the pony motor, Warren had told him, more than once, in the particular patient tone he saved for machinery and almost nothing else. She'll flood on you if you're impatient, same as anything worth doing right. Prime her slow. Let her breathe before you ask her to work. Eli primed the small two-cylinder gasoline engine bolted to the side of the massive diesel block, now the same unhurried way, checking the choke, working the fuel line by feel more than sight in the dim shed light. The pony motor's whole purpose was simple and entirely mechanical. No battery, no computer, nothing electronic to fail with age. It existed to spin the big diesel engine over until the larger block caught on its own, a small engine doing the patient work of waking a much larger one. He pulled the starter cord the way his father had shown him decades earlier, missed on the first pull the way he half expected to after 15 years, and got it on the second. The pony motor coughed twice, then caught, sputtering to life with a high, tinny rasp entirely unlike the sound the machine would eventually make. Eli let it run a full minute, warming the block, resisting the urge to rush the way his father had once warned him against, before he engaged the clutch that would use the little gas engine's spin to turn over the enormous diesel beside it. The D8 barked once, blew a towering column of black smoke into the afternoon air, and settled into a deep, rhythmic idle that Eli felt through the ground more than heard, a sound he hadn't stood this close to in 15 years and had somehow never forgotten the feel of. It settled into his chest the same way it had at 17. Not loud exactly, just enormous, the particular presence of a machine built entirely out of iron and gearing rather than anything that could be rushed or shortcut. Two of the younger crew members had drifted over to watch by the time Eli climbed up into the seat. That thing belongs in a museum, one of them said, not unkindly, mostly just amused. Eli didn't answer. He eased the machine forward, out of the shed and down toward the road, and the ground shook faintly under its tracks the whole way. He didn't attack the stump the way the excavators had. He started well off to the side, cutting a narrow trench along a line only he seemed to understand the logic of, working the D8's blade in short, careful passes instead of the brute, single point pulling the modern equipment had tried. The foreman, whose name was Deacon Voss, walked over after 20 minutes with the particular patience of a man watching something he didn't yet respect, but was no longer quite comfortable mocking either. Mr. Mercer, respectfully, my crew already tried digging around it. Went 2 feet down on every side. There's nothing there but more root. You dug where the stump told you to dig, Eli said, not looking up from the machine. I'm digging where the ground's telling me to. Voss didn't have an answer for that, and stood watching a while longer before walking back to his own crew, who'd mostly stopped packing up their trucks in favor of watching the old man work. A couple of the younger men had pulled out their phones, filming without much conviction that there'd be anything worth showing anyone by the end of the afternoon. Eli exposed a root 2 hours in, thick as a man's thigh, running not toward the stump but away from it, angled deep beneath where the road survey had marked the construction path, a direction none of the crew's own digging had bothered to check, since every modern instinct in the business said to dig toward the obstacle, not away from it. He climbed down, knees protesting the movement in a way they hadn't 20 years earlier, and tapped the exposed root with a steel bar out of old habit more than real expectation. The sound came back hollow. He tapped it again, further along, to be sure he hadn't imagined it. Same sound. Deep, resonant, unmistakably wrong for a solid root system that should have sounded like nothing more than dense, packed wood. Voss, he called out, not raising his voice much, though something in his tone brought the foreman over at a jog anyway. Come listen to this. He'd brought an old survey map with him that morning, folded in his jacket pocket, the kind of document the contractors had assumed was useless the moment they saw how faded it was. Eli spread it on the tailgate of his truck now, tracing a line with one finger that ran almost exactly beneath where he'd just found the hollow root. "There was a logging road through here," he said, when Voss and the engineer came over to look. "Before my daddy's time, even. Settlers built a drainage system under it, stone channel, timber supports, the whole thing buried and forgotten before anybody living remembers seeing it. That pine didn't just happen to grow where it did. Its roots grew around that stonework and locked it into the hillside." He tapped the hollow spot on the map. "You weren't fighting a stump today. You were fighting the whole hillside, and the hillside's had 100 years longer than you to get stubborn about it." The engineer studied the map with the particular skepticism of a man trained to trust surveys over stories. "This map's got no county stamp on it. No date I can verify. For all I know, it's just an old sketch your father made for fun." "Could be," Eli allowed. "Or you could tap that root with a bar yourself and tell me what you hear." The engineer did, crouching down with visible reluctance, and went quiet when the same hollow sound came back under his own hand instead of Eli's. He looked at the map again, then at the root, then at Eli, clearly unsure whether to believe an old farmer's story over his own crew's excavation report, but no longer quite as confident in his own certainty either. "Even if you're right," he finally said, "we don't have a budget line for archaeology. We have a road to finish." "Wasn't asking for a budget line," Eli said. "Just asking for the afternoon." Nobody had a better explanation for why two modern machines had failed against a single tree stump, and that uncertainty, more than any argument Eli could have made, bought him the time to keep working. The careful digging took the better part of 2 days. Eli worked the D8 in short, deliberate passes, exposing individual roots rather than attacking the mass of them at once, occasionally stopping to tap the ground with his steel bar and listen for the change in sound that told him where stone started and root ended. His hands ached by the end of the first day in a way they hadn't in years, the particular exhaustion of a body that remembered how to do this work but hadn't been asked to in a long while. There was a rough stretch that first evening when Eli misjudged the angle on a pass along the route's northern edge, and the blade caught something solid enough to jolt the whole machine, killing the engine outright. He climbed down convinced he'd cracked stonework he hadn't even confirmed existed yet, and spent a tense 20 minutes clearing dirt by hand in the fading light before he found what he'd actually hit. An old fence post, iron, sunk deep enough to have survived whatever had happened to the rest of the fence line around it. Not the culvert, but close enough to it that Eli understood, kneeling there with dirt under his fingernails, that he was working in exactly the right place, however slowly. By the second afternoon, with several of the crew now watching more out of genuine curiosity than mockery, Eli's blade caught the edge of something that wasn't root or stone either. He climbed down and cleared it by hand. Old, hand-cut timber, blackened with age but structurally intact, laid in a pattern too deliberate to be anything but built. "That's a beam," Voss said, crouching beside him. "A real one. Somebody framed this. Somebody who knew what they were doing," Eli said, running a hand along the wood. "This wasn't thrown together in an afternoon. Look how it's notched. That's joinery, not just stacked lumber." They cleared enough over the next hour to expose a section of dry-laid stone running beneath the timber. A channel, clearly, though nobody could say yet what it had once carried. Eli recognized the construction the moment enough of it was visible. His father had told him stories, once or twice, about an old farmstead somewhere on this hillside. Stories Eli had always assumed were exaggerated the way old men's stories about their own fathers sometimes were. He was starting to understand he'd been wrong to assume that. A woman from the county paper showed up that same afternoon, having heard secondhand from someone at the feed store that the old Mercer place had turned up something unusual under a tree stump. She stood at the edge of the site with a notepad, watching Eli work the D8 in short, careful passes rather than the aggressive digging she'd apparently expected. "Folks are saying you knew there was something down here before anybody dug," she said. "That true?" "Didn't know what," Eli said, not stopping the work. "Knew my father didn't want that tree touched. Took me most of my life and a road project to find out why." "And the tractor?" "Everybody's asking about the tractor." Eli allowed himself a small, tired smile at that. "Machine's 76 years old, and it's done more honest work today than most things built since. Write that down if you want. It's the truest thing I've told you." The story ran 2 days later, small on the front page, but enough to get people talking. which was how word of what was happening on the old Mercer place started moving through the county faster than Eli would have preferred, though he found he didn't much mind it once it started. The county couldn't simply let the discovery halt the project. A project manager named Reyes drove out the next morning, listened to Voss's account with visible impatience, and made it clear the road had a deadline the county commissioners weren't going to extend for an unverified pile of old stonework. "We need that stump out and that channel filled," Reyes said, barely glancing at the exposed timber beam before turning back to Voss. "Today, if the equipment can manage it, we can document what's there first, take some photographs for the county record, but this project does not stop for archaeology. That channel's not just old drainage," Eli said. "I don't know what it's connected to yet. Filling it blind is a bad idea. With respect, Mr. Mercer, we don't have the timeline for I don't know yet. I've got commissioners asking me why a road that was supposed to open next month is suddenly held up by a tree stump and a farmer's map. Then tell them the truth. Tell them the ground under that stump might be structural to half the hillside, and filling it blind risks the road itself, not just some old stonework nobody's asked you to save." Reyes looked at him a long moment, clearly unmoved, clearly also not entirely comfortable dismissing it outright. "I'll give you until end of day tomorrow. After that, this gets filled whether we understand it or not." Eli didn't get the chance to argue further, because the sky did the arguing for him. The storm rolled in that same afternoon, faster and harder than anything the forecast had predicted, the kind of violent, fast system that turns a construction site into a genuine hazard within an hour. Rain filled the excavation almost immediately, and within the worst 20 minutes of it, water began pouring directly through the newly exposed stone channel with a force that told everyone standing there this wasn't ordinary runoff. "That's not rainwater pooling," Eli shouted over the noise, watching the channel run clear and steady even as the surrounding mud turned to soup. "That's a spring. Whole hillside's been built to move it." A section of the freshly graded road began sliding toward the excavation as the ground around it saturated past what it could hold, and the modern equipment, parked well back from the worst of the mud, tires already sinking where they stood, couldn't safely reach the section that needed clearing most. Reyes was shouting into a phone that had almost no signal in the storm, trying to raise anyone from the county who could authorize an emergency response, while Voss's crew scrambled to move what equipment they could to higher ground before it sank entirely. Eli could reach the section that mattered. He fired the D8 back up in weather that would have grounded anything hydraulic dependent, tracks finding purchase where wheeled equipment simply couldn't, mud sheeting off the tracks in dark waves as he worked the machine down the slope toward the collapsing bank. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, rain coming sideways hard enough to sting, and Eli worked half by feel, half by the memory of exactly where that channel ran that he'd built up over 2 days of careful digging. He used the old machine to drag a fallen support timber away from the channel mouth before the collapsing bank could crush it entirely, the D8's engine laboring against mud thick enough to fight back, tracks slipping once, twice, before finding purchase again. Nobody was laughing at the tractor anymore. Voss stood at the edge of the site, soaked through, watching a 76-year-old machine do the one thing every piece of modern equipment on site that afternoon physically could not. By the time the worst of the storm passed, nearly an hour later, the roadbed had held, the channel remained clear, and Eli sat on the D8 in the rain, breathing hard, understanding that his father's old warning about that pine had just saved considerably more than a tree. Once the water receded enough to work safely, what they found climbing higher up the hillside changed the shape of the whole story. The stone channel didn't end at the road. It continued upslope toward the remains of an old farmstead nobody currently living had ever mapped, a collapsed stone foundation, a caved root cellar, and beside it, an old hand-dug well gone dry decades earlier. Eli climbed down into the root cellar himself, careful of the collapsed section near the entrance, a flashlight in one hand, and 60 years of familiarity with this hillside doing nothing to prepare him for what he found waiting in the dark. The space had survived remarkably intact given how long it had sat forgotten, wooden shelving still standing along one wall, gone gray and soft with age, and beneath it, a small wooden box that had somehow kept most of its contents dry despite decades of dampness working at everything around it. Inside, protected under decades of fallen earth, They found a small collection of survey markers and handwritten land records, brittle with age but legible. Eli worked through them slowly, sitting on an overturned crate in the cellar's dim light, piecing together names and dates that connected, however distantly, to his own family line going back further than he'd ever bothered tracing. One record, written in a careful, formal hand entirely different from anything else in the box, described the water system in terms specific enough that Eli read it twice to be sure he understood it correctly. A deliberate network of stone channels engineered to carry spring water down from a natural aquifer higher on the hillside, distributed across what had once been 3 separate family farms before they'd consolidated, generations back, into the single property Eli now owned outright. The settlers hadn't simply diverted water for their own farm. They'd built something meant to outlast any one family's ownership of the land, meant to keep working for whoever came after, whether that family understood what they'd inherited or not. And near the bottom of the collection, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp out entirely, a single photograph. Eli's father stood in it, young, beside a D8 that still had its factory paint. Behind him stood the original farmstead, whole and working. And at the corner of the frame, unmistakable even in an old photograph, stood the pine, already tall, already exactly where it would stand for the next 7 decades. Eli sat with that photograph a long while before he said anything, running his thumb along the edge of it the way you handle something you're afraid might not survive being touched at all. He wasn't sentimental about that tree. He finally told Voss, who'd stayed to look at what they'd found rather than push the crew back to work. I always figured he was. Turns out he knew exactly what was under it. His own father must have told him. This whole hillside was built on purpose, to catch spring water and move it where the farm needed it. And that pine grew up marking the one spot you couldn't disturb without breaking the whole system. Man kept a secret like that his whole life and never told you outright. Told me not to cut the tree, Eli said. That was the whole of it. I suppose he figured that was enough, and it near enough was. I just didn't understand it till I had a reason to dig. Reyes came back out 2 days after the storm, once the survey records from the root cellar had been photographed and sent to the county historical office. He stood at the edge of the exposed channel a long while, considerably quieter than he'd been on his first visit. Hydrologist, I sent these records to says this spring's been feeding groundwater across 3 properties, not just yours, he told Eli. Says if we'd filled that channel like I wanted to, we'd likely have flooded half this road within 2 years, maybe sooner, and spent 10 times the cost we're looking at now fixing it after the fact. Wasn't trying to prove you wrong, Eli said. Just trying to keep from filling in something I didn't understand yet. I know that now. Reyes looked out at the channel, then back at Eli, something like genuine respect in his expression that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. I'm recommending we redesign this section. Curve around the channel instead of through it. It'll cost more up front. Costs a lot less than what almost happened. The county redesigned that section of the road over the following weeks, once Reyes had seen the survey records and understood exactly what they'd nearly destroyed. The stone channel was preserved rather than filled. A hydrologist confirmed what Eli had already worked out by ear and instinct. The spring had been feeding groundwater across the property for well over a century, quietly, until modern construction had come close to cutting it off entirely. Voss came by the shed himself, the week the project finally wrapped, and stood looking at the D8 a long moment before he said anything. I owe you an apology, he said. Called that machine a museum piece the first day I met you. Been doing this work 18 years, figured I'd seen every kind of stubborn ground there was. Never once stopped to think the stubbornness might be trying to tell me something instead of just being in my way. You didn't know what was under there, Eli said. Nobody did. Machine's not the one that gets credit for that. It just does what it's told, same as it's done since 1948. Maybe so, but I've run crews with equipment worth more than most people's houses, and not one piece of it could do what your father's tractor did in that storm. Voss shook his head slowly. My own granddad ran equipment like this, back in his day. I used to think stories about the old iron outlasting the new stuff were just nostalgia talking. Don't think that anymore. Voss didn't argue the point further, though he stood a while longer looking at the old tractor with something closer to respect than the amusement he'd started the week with. With the channel safely rerouted around and protected under a small stone marker the county agreed to install, Eli finally brought the D8 back to the stump itself. The actual pull, the thing the modern excavators had failed at from the very first afternoon, now attempted with the culvert beneath it fully exposed, mapped, and out of danger. Word had gotten around the county by then, the way it does in a place small enough that a storm and a buried farmstead made for genuine conversation at the diner counter. A small crowd had gathered along the road's edge that morning. A few neighbors, a reporter from the county paper, and Eli's grandson Micah, 16, who'd driven up from 2 towns over the moment he heard what his grandfather had been doing all week. Eli hadn't asked him to come. He was glad anyway that he had. "You nervous, Grandpa?" Micah asked, standing at the fence the way Eli himself had once stood watching his own father work this same machine decades earlier. "Not nervous," Eli said. "Just don't want to rush it. Man rushes a pull like this, he loses the chain, the stump, maybe a finger if he's careless enough. Learned that from your great-great-grandfather. Same as everything else about this machine." He didn't rush it. He wrapped a logging chain around the base, links thick as a man's wrist, nothing like the lighter chain that had snapped on the first day, and found the angle by feel rather than guesswork. Lo, along the grain of the roots he'd spent 2 days learning individually rather than fighting as one mass. He eased the D8 forward until the chain went taut, then held there a long moment, letting the machine's weight do the first, patient work before he opened the throttle further. The engine's pitch deepened. The tracks bit into ground that had already been softened and mapped rather than blindly torn at. For several long seconds nothing appeared to happen at all, the whole crowd watching in a silence considerably different from the mockery of 2 days earlier. Then, with a crack that carried clean across the hillside, the last deep root gave way underground, and the stump came free all at once, dragged clear of the hole it had occupied for the better part of a century. The D8 barely straining underweight that had defeated 2 modern excavators outright. Nobody cheered. The moment felt too large for that, more like watching something finally exhale after decades of holding its breath. Micah climbed over the fence once the track stopped moving and walked straight to the stump, running a hand along roots that had just spent 100 years locked into that hillside. Looking at his grandfather with something close to the same expression Eli imagined he must have worn at 17. Watching Warren do something similar. Months later, the road ran exactly where the county had always planned, curved slightly around the preserved stone channel instead of through it, water still moving quietly beneath a small marker plaque that named the old farmstead and the settlers who'd built the system nobody alive had known to look for. The stump itself sat nearby, kept rather than hauled off, part of the same small historical marker the county had agreed to install once they understood what they'd nearly destroyed. Micah had taken to coming out most weekends that fall, learning the D8 the same slow, patient way Eli had learned it from Warren decades earlier, priming the pony motor, listening for the catch, understanding that some machines and some pieces of land asked more of a person than speed ever could. Eli didn't push him toward it. He simply left the shed unlocked and let his grandson find his own way to caring about it, the same courtesy Warren had once extended him. Eli stood beside the D8 one evening that fall, hand resting on the same hood his father had once stood beside in a photograph taken decades before Eli was born. The machine had outlasted 3 landowners' worth of newer equipment, survived storms and neglect, and 15 years under a tarp, and asked nothing more of the world than the chance to do exactly what it had always been built to do. The contractors had been right, in a way, about one thing. Nothing they brought could pull that stump out. They'd just been looking at the stump the whole time. Eli had spent his whole life, without fully realizing it, learning to look at the land around it instead. If a story like this, where the real discovery was never the thing everyone was fighting, but what it had been quietly protecting the whole time, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever understood something your own family tried to protect only once you were old enough to dig into it yourself, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.